Greetings, one and all, in the most cursed, most cringiest corner of the internet. A YouTube channel content creator actively alienating everyone in both the analog and digital world. Well, welcome and good evening, you wonderful dice of all alignments. I am Lunar D8. We are reading The Tragedy of X by Ellery Queen. Act 3, Scene 3. The Weehawken, Newburgh local, Saturday, October 10, 12:20 a.m. They had split into two groups. Jean Lord and the Cavalier Imperial sat well forward in the car, chattering. DeWitt, Lane, Brooks, and Ahern took places nearer the center of the coach and facing seats. The train was still in the Weehawken terminal when the lawyer, who had been staring at DeWitt with frank eyes, turned his head toward Drury Lane, who sat opposite, and said abruptly, "Do you know, something you said tonight, Mr. Lane, interested me very much. You spoke of the interminable years that are packed into a single moment. The moment during which a man waits at the bar for the jury verdict, which will condemn him to death or send him from the courtroom with a fresh lease on life. Interminable years, dandy phrase, Mr. Lane. An accurate phrase, said DeWitt. You think so? Brooks stole a look at DeWitt's composed features. It reminded me at the time of a story I once read. I think it was by Ambrose Bierce. A very strange story indeed. It was about a man who was being hanged in the molecular instant before his neck snapped. This man saw the details of his entire lifetime projected in his brain. There's your interminable years idea, Mr. Lane, in literature, and I have no doubt it's been treated by many other writers. I believe I know the story, replied Mr. Lane. DeWitt at Brooks' side nodded. This whole problem of time is relative, as our scientists have been telling us for some years. Dreams, for example, dreams which seem on awakening to have occupied the brain through all the silent hours of the night, are said by some psychologists to occupy in actuality only the last, the borderline moment between subconsciousness of sleep and the consciousness of wakefulness. I've heard that too, said Ahern. He was sitting opposite DeWitt and Brooks and facing forward. What I was really getting at, said Brooks, he was looking at DeWitt again, was the application of this particular mental phenomenon to you, John. I couldn't help wondering, I suppose many of us did, just what your thoughts were in the instant before the verdict was given today. Perhaps, said Drury Lane gently, perhaps Mr. DeWitt would rather not say. On the contrary, the broker's eyes gleamed. His face was alive. That moment provided me with one of the most startling experiences of my life, an experience that bears out, I think, both Bierce's principle and the dream theory which Mr. Lane just mentioned. You don't mean to say that your whole life flashed through your mind at that moment? Ahern seemed vastly skeptical. Oh, no. Something so isolated, so strange. DeWitt slumped against the green cushions, speaking rapidly. A case of identity. About 9 years ago, I was called for jury duty in a murder trial here in New York. The defendant was an old hulking wreck of a man accused of stabbing a woman to death in a cheap boarding house. It was a case of first-degree murder. The district attorney proved conclusively that the murder was deliberately planned, and there was no question of the man's guilt. All during the short trial, and even in the jury room afterward, as we argued his fate, I was haunted by a feeling that somewhere I had seen the defendant before, as people do in such situations. I wrestled mentally with the problem of his identity until I was tired, but I could not recall who he was, or where or when I had seen him. With blasting and straining and rattling, the train started. DeWitt raised his voice a little. To make a long story short, I concurred in the general opinion that the man was guilty. On the basis of the evidence brought out, cast my ballot for conviction. We brought in the verdict, and the man was duly sentenced and executed. I dismissed the entire incident from my mind. The train ground out of the terminal. No one spoke as DeWitt paused, licking his lips. Now, here's the strange part of it. To the best of my recollection, I never once thought of that man or the incident for the 9 years that followed. But when today the foreman was asked for the verdict, which meant so much to me, that ridiculously tiny interval between the last syllable of the official question and the first word of the foreman's official reply suddenly, and for no reason that I can offer, the face of that executed man, by now crumbling earth, swung before my eyes, and in the same instant I solved the problem of who he was and where I had seen him 9 years, remember, after I had last been disturbed by it. And who was he? Asked Brooks curiously. DeWitt smiled. I said it was strange. 20 years ago or so, at the time when I was wandering about South America, I chanced to be in a place called Barinas, in the Zamora country of Venezuela. One night, on my way to my lodgings, as I was passing a dark alley, I heard the sounds of a violent scuffle. I was young then, and of a more venturesome disposition, I dare say, than I am now. I carried a revolver. I snatched it from the holster and ran into the alley. 2 ragged breeds were attacking a white man. One of them was brandishing a machete over the head of their victim. I fired. The shot went wild, but the 2 footpads were alarmed, I suppose, and fled, leaving the white man already slashed in several places on the ground. As I went over to him, thinking he was badly wounded, he got to his feet, brushed off his dirty, bloody ducks, mumbled surly thanks, and swung off, limping in the darkness. I had caught a glimpse of his face, and this man whose life I had been instrumental in saving 20 years ago was the man whom more than a decade later I was instrumental in sending to the electric chair. Sort of divine dispensation, eh? Worthy, said Mr. Drury Lane, in the silence that followed, of a place in imperishable folklore. The train was pushing through the blackness, which was dotted here and there by lights, the outskirts of Weehawken. But the peculiar part of it, continued DeWitt, was that, of all the things I should solve, that tantalizing mystery while my own life was in jeopardy, remember that I had seen the man's face only once before, so many years ago. One of the most amazing things I've ever heard, said Brooks. The human mind is capable of even more amazing things than that. And the instant before death, said Lane, 8 months ago I saw in the newspapers a press dispatch from Vienna. Evening. Giving the details of a murder there. The facts were these. A man was found shot to death in a hotel room. The Viennese police easily identified him as an unimportant underworld figure who was known to have served as an informer for the police in the past. The motive for the crime was obviously revenge, probably by some criminal against whom the man's tips to the law had operated disastrously. The news dispatch stated that the victim had been living in this hotel for months, rarely leaving his room, even having his meals served there. That he was hiding from someone was apparent. When he was found murdered, the remains of his last meal were spread out on the table. He had been shot while standing 7 feet from the table, a fatal shot, but not causing instant death. This was determined by the fact that a trail of blood led across the carpet from this spot to the place where he was found dead, sprawled at the foot of the table. There was a peculiar circumstance. The sugar bowl on the table had been overturned. The granulated sugar was scattered on the cloth, and in the victim's dead hand, tightly clenched, was a handful of this granulated sugar. Interesting, murmured DeWitt. The explanation seemed simple enough. He had been shot 7 feet from the table, had crawled to the table, and by superhuman effort managed to raise himself sufficiently to take a fistful of sugar from the bowl before collapsing dead on the floor. But why? What was the significance of the sugar? How explain this last desperate act of a dying man? The Viennese police were baffled, concluded the dispatch. Mr. Drury Lane smiled at his audience. The answer to these provocative questions occurred to me, and I wrote to Vienna. A few weeks later I received a reply from the prefect prefect of police there, saying that the murderer had been arrested before the arrival of my letter, but that my solution had clarified the incident of the dead man and the sugar, which, even after the murderer's apprehension, had remained inexplicable to the police. And what was your solution? Asked Ahern. From the meager details, I, for one, can't see a possible explanation. Nor I, said Brooks. DeWitt's mouth was screwed into a weird shape. He was frowning. And you, Mr. DeWitt? Asked Lane, smiling again. I'm afraid I can't see the significance of the sugar itself, replied the broker thoughtfully. But one thing seems perfectly obvious. That is that the dying man was leaving a clue to his assassin's identity. Excellent, cried Lane. That's it exactly, Mr. DeWitt. Very well. Observe. Was the sugar as sugar the clue? That is, was the victim indicating that his murder was, to stretch the point to its most farcical implication, a lover of sweets? On the other hand, did it imply that the murderer was a diabetic? Far-fetched, of course. I did not believe this, for the clue was undoubtedly left for the edification of the police, and it would seem that the dying man would leave a clue on which the police could work with a fair chance of success. On the other hand, what else could the sugar have meant? What does granulated sugar resemble physically? Well, it is a white crystalline substance. I thereupon wrote the Viennese prefect that while sugar might have indicated the murderer was a diabetic, the more probable explanation was that the murderer was a cocaine addict. They were staring at him. DeWitt chuckled, slapping his thighs softly. Cocaine, of course. A white crystalline powder. The man arrested, continued Lane, was what our tabloids amusingly refer to as a cocaine fiend. So wrote my official correspondent, and offered many flowery expressions of admiration. Yet it seems to me that the explanation was an elementary one. What interested me was the psychology of the murdered man. He could not have possessed an ordinary intellect. Somewhere within his brain was a spark of ingenuity. He left the only clue to his murderer's identity which was available to him in the brief interval before he died. So you see, there are no limits to which the human mind cannot soar in that unique godlike instant before the end of life. No, that is perfectly true, said DeWitt. That's an interesting story, Mr. Lane. And despite your dismissal of the deduction as elementary, I think the entire affair is a tribute to your peculiar talent for getting beneath the surface of things. Should have been there in Vienna, and he'd have saved the police a heap of trouble, said Ahern. North Bergen disappeared in the darkness. Lane sighed. I have often thought that the entire problem of crime and punishment would be simplified if human beings confronted by their potential murderers could leave a sign, no matter how obscure, to the identity of their nemesis. No matter how obscure, asked Brooks argumentatively. Of course, Mr. Brooks, isn't any sign better than no sign at all? A tall, burly man had hat pulled down low over his eyes, face white and pinched, had entered the car from the forward end. He lurched over to the four conversing men, leaned heavily against the green-diced fabric of a seat back, swaying with the rock of the train glowering over them at John DeWitt. Lane paused, glancing up at him in annoyance, but DeWitt said in a disgusted voice, "Collins?" And the actor regarded the man with newborn interest. Brooks said, "You're drunk, Collins. What do you want?" "Not talking to you, shyster," said Collins in a thick voice. His eyes were bloodshot and maniacal. They focused with difficulty on DeWitt. "DeWitt," he said, with an attempt at civility, "like to see you alone." He pushed his hat back on his head, endeavoring to smile in a pleasant manner. He achieved only the sick mockery of a smile, and DeWitt looked at him with pity and distaste. The Drury Lane's grey eyes went from Collins' heavy face to DeWitt's delicately lined one, unceasingly, as each man talked. "Now look here, Collins," said DeWitt in a gentler tone. "I've told you repeatedly that I can't do anything for you on that matter. You know why, and you're making yourself very disagreeable. Can't you see that you're interrupting a private party? Be a good chap and go away." Collins Colin's mouth was slack. His red-rimmed eyes became bleared and teary. "Listen, DeWitt," he muttered. "You've got to let me talk to you. You don't know what this means to me, DeWitt. It's life or death." DeWitt wavered. The others did not look at each other. The spectacle of this man in his naked humility was embarrassing. Collins rushed on, snatching at the faint hope promised by DeWitt's hesitation. "I promise, I swear I won't bother you again if you let me talk to you privately just this once. Please, DeWitt, please." DeWitt measured him coolly. "You mean that, Collins? You won't bother me again? Won't hound me this way?" "Yes, you can rely on it." The hope that flared in those bloody eyes was ghastly. DeWitt rose with a sigh, excused himself, and the two men, DeWitt with bent head, Collins speaking rapidly, violently, gesticulating, pleading, peering into DeWitt's averted face, walked up the aisle toward the rear of the car. DeWitt suddenly left Collins standing in the aisle and returned to his three companions. The broker put his hand into his upper left vest pocket and took out the single ticket he had purchased in the terminal, leaving the new trip book in the pocket. He gave them to Ahern. "Might as well give them to the conductor, Frank," he said. "I don't know how long this pest will take. Conductor will get me later." Ahern nodded, and DeWitt retraced his steps to the rear of the car where Collins stood in an attitude of dejection. He lumbered to life at DeWitt's approach, and again he began to plead. They passed through the doorway to the rear platform, were indistinctly visible for a moment, and then the three men saw Collins and DeWitt cross over to the stand on the front platform of the last dim car passing from view. Brooks said, "There's a man who played with fire and got his fingers badly burned. He's through. DeWitt would be a fool to help him." "Still wants DeWitt to make good. Longstreet's disastrous advice, I suppose," remarked Ahern. "I shouldn't be surprised if John relents, do you know? He's in high spirits, and he's liable to make Longstreet's foolishness good out of sheer joy of living." Drury Lane said nothing. He turned his head and looked toward the rear platform, but the two men were not in sight. At this moment the conductor entered from the forward door, beginning to collect the punch tickets, and the men turned back. The moment of tension gone, Lord referred to the conductor to the group of three men in the center of the car, looking around, seeming surprised at DeWitt's absence. The conductor approached. Ahern offered him the 6 single tickets, explaining that there was another man in the party who had stepped out a moment and would be back shortly. "Right," said the conductor, punching the tickets and jabbing them into one of the ticket holders on the top of the seat in which Ahern was sitting, and he moved on up the car. The three men engaged in desultory conversation. The talk petered out in a few moments, and Ahern, excusing himself, rose, thrust his hands into his pockets, and began to pace up and down the aisle. Lane and Brooks became involved in a discussion of testaments. Lane cited a curious case which he had run across many years before while he was touring the continent and Shakespearean repertoire. Brooks countered with several instances of ambiguous wills which had raised complicated questions of law. The train clanked on. Twice Lane turned his head and peered backward, but neither DeWitt nor Collins was visible. A tiny furrow appeared between the actor's eyes, and he sat thoughtfully during a lull in his conversation with Brooks. Then he smiled, shook his head as if dismissing the nonsense of his thoughts, and resumed the discussion. The locals staggered to a stop at the station of Bogota, a suburb of Hackensack. Lane stared out the window as the train started again. The furrow between his eyes returned more deeply now. He looked at the dial of his watch. The hands stood at 12:36. Brooks was regarding him with a puzzled expression. Lane sprang to his feet so suddenly that Brooks uttered a grunt of astonishment. "Please excuse me, Mr. Brooks," he said rapidly. "Perhaps my nerves are ragged, but I can't help feeling extraordinarily disturbed by the failure of DeWitt to return. I am going back there to investigate. You think there's something wrong?" Brooks was alarmed. He rose and strode up the aisle with Lane. "I sincerely hope not." They passed Ahern, pacing fretfully. "Anything wrong, gentlemen?" he inquired. "Mr. Lane thinks there's something funny about DeWitt's absence," snapped the lawyer. "Come along, Ahern." Lane in the van. They went through the rear door of their car and stopped short. There was no one on the platform. They stepped across the swaying junction of the two cars. There was no one on the rear platform, the last car either. They looked at each other. Well, where the devil could they have gone? Muttered Ahern. I didn't see either of them come back, did you? I wasn't noticing particularly, said Brooks, but I don't think they did. Lane paid them not the slightest attention. He went to the glass top of one of the doors and looked out at the rushing black countryside. Then he returned and surveyed the door of the dim, almost indistinguishable rear car. He peered through the glass into the interior. It was evidently an extra coach being hauled to the Newburgh, the end of the local line, to be ready for an early morning rush hour run back to Weehawken. His jaw hardened and he said distinctly, I am going in here, gentlemen. Mr. Brooks, will you please hold the door open? There's very little light. He grasped the knob of the door and pushed. The door responded readily enough. It was unlocked. For a moment as the three men stood there squinting to accustom their eyes to the almost total absence of illumination, they could see nothing. Then Lane turned his head abruptly and sucked in his breath. To the left of the door was a walled compartment, the usual cubicle found at the entrance to railroad day coaches. The front wall of the car and a wall backing up the first seat in the car beyond formed two of the boundaries. On the other side was a regular car window, and opposite it where Lane stood an open area. In the compartment, as in the other portions of the car, were two long seats facing each other. On the seat opposite the front wall, sitting on the cushions close to the window wall, head sunk on his breast, was the figure of John DeWitt. Lane's eyes narrowed in the murk. The broker seemed to sleep. Brooks and Ahern pressing behind, he edged into the area between the two seats and touched DeWitt gently on the shoulder. There was no response. DeWitt, he said in a steely rapier voice, shaking the quiet figure. Still no response, but this time DeWitt's head rolled slightly, bringing his eyes into view. Then they rolled to rest again. The eyes, even in the dimness, were the open, blank eyes of a corpse. Lane crouched, and his hand hovered about the man's heart. He straightened up, rubbed his fingers together, and backed out of the compartment. Ahern was shaking like an aspen, staring down at the still, shadowy figure. Brooks quavered, He's dead? There's blood on my hand, said Lane. Please keep that door open. Mr. Brooks, we need light, at least until we can get to someone to turn on the proper switch. He stepped past Ahern and Brooks to the platform. Please do not touch him, either of you, he said sharply. Neither replied. They cowered together instinctively, keeping their eyes with a sort of horrified fascination of the dead man. Looking overhead, Lane located what he saw and stretched his long arm upward. He pulled vigorously several times. It was the emergency signal cord. With a crashing and grinding of brakes, the train slid, jerked, and shivered to a stop. Ahern and Brooks clutched at each other to keep from falling. Lane stepped across the car junction and opened the door to the lighted car in which they had been seated. He stood silently for a moment. Imperial was sitting alone, now dozing. Lord and Jean sat close together, heads almost touching. There were several other passengers, most of them napping or reading. The door at the opposite end of the car burst open, and two conductors ran up the aisle toward Lane instantly. The passengers awoke or dropped their magazines and newspapers, sensing something wrong. Jean and Lord looked up. Startled, Imperial got to his feet, a questioning look on his face. The two conductors rushed up. Who pulled the emergency? Cried the first, a small, choleric old man. What's the idea, anyway? Lane said in a low voice, There has been a serious accident, conductor. Please come back here with me. Jean, Lord, and Imperial ran toward them. The other passengers thronged about, asking bewildered questions. No, please. Miss DeWitt? It would be better if you did not come back with us, Mr. Lord. Take Miss DeWitt back to her seat, Mr. Imperial. You might stay here also. He looked significantly at Lord. The young man paled, then took the bewildered girl's arm and forcibly conducted her back through the car. The second conductor, a tall, heavy man, began to push the crowding passengers. Back to your seats, please. Don't ask questions. Back now. Lane, accompanied by the two conductors, returned to the rear car, and Brooks and Ahern had not moved. Petrified, they were still staring at DeWitt's body. One of the conductors manipulated a switch in the wall of the rear car. The hitherto dim coach sprang into clear view as the lights flashed on. All three men went into the car, pushing Brooks and Ahern ahead of them. The tall conductor closed the door. The small and elder man edged into the compartment and bent over, heavy gold watch dangling from the chain on his vest. His aged finger pointed to the left breast of the dead man. "Bullet hole," he exclaimed. "Murder." He straightened up and stared at Lane. Lane said quietly, "I should advise you to touch nothing, conductor." He took a card from his wallet and offered it to the old man. "I have been acting in the capacity of consulting investigator in several recent murder cases," he said. "I have authority, I think, in this matter." The elder conductor examined the card suspiciously, then handed it back. He took off his cap and scratched his white poll. "Well, I don't know," he said with a touch of exacerbation. "How do I know this isn't a stall? I'm senior conductor on this train, and the law says I'm in charge of it at all times and in any emergency. Look here," broke in Brooks. "This is Mr. Drury Lane, and he has been helping out on the Longstreet and Wood murders. You must have read about them." "Oh!" The old man rasped his chin. "Do you know who this dead man is?" continued Brooks, his voice cracking. "It's John DeWitt, Longstreet's partner." "You don't say!" exclaimed the conductor. He looked doubtfully at DeWitt's half-hidden face. Then he brightened. "Come to think of it, I guess he does look sort of familiar. Been taking this train a long time. Okay, Mr. Lane, I guess you're the boss. What do you want us to do?" Lane had stood silently during this colloquy. I don't know how to pronounce that, but I understand, soliloquy and stuff like that. Shakespeare words. But impatience glittered in his eyes. He snapped at once. "Make sure that all doors and even windows are kept locked and guarded at once. Instruct the engineer to run this train to the nearest station." "There's Teaneck, next stop along the line," volunteered the tall conductor. "Whatever it is," continued Lane, "make all the speed you can. Arrange to call New York police. Inspector Thum, either at headquarters or at his home, and District Attorney Bruno of New York County, if possible. Get the station master to do that," said the old man thoughtfully. "Precisely, and secure authority, whatever authority is necessary to shunt this train off the main track into a siding at Teaneck. Your name, conductor?" "They call me Pop Bottomley." "That's a horrible name," said the old man soberly. "I got you, Mr. Lane." "Thoroughly understood, then, Bottomley," said Lane. "Please attend to these things at once." The two conductors moved to the door. Bottomley said to his junior, Now I'm going down to talk to the engineer, and you see the doors." "Get me, Ed?" "Sure thing." They ran out of the car, making their way through the throng of passengers crowded about the doors. The other car, there was silence when they left out. Ahern leaned with sudden weakness against the door of the toilet on the other side of the aisle. Brooks put his back on the door. Lane surveyed the mortal remains of John DeWitt somberly. He spoke without turning his head. "Ahern, as DeWitt's best friend, it will be your unpleasant duty to break the news to his daughter." Ahern stiffened and moistened his lips, but left the car without a word, and Brooks leaned against the door again, and Lane stood like a sentinel by the side of the dead. Neither spoke, neither moved. From forward cars came faint shouting. They stood in exactly the same positions when a few moments later the train shuddered the length of its ponderous steel body and began to crawl on outside darkness. A siding at Teaneck later. The train lights blazing lay like a helpless caterpillar in the darkness of the rusty siding near the station of Teaneck. The station itself was alive with scurrying figures. A roaring automobile rushed out of the night and crashed to a stop by the tracks, discharging immediately a number of bulky forms that plunged toward the idle train. The newcomer were Thum, Bruno, Dr. Schilling, and a small group of detectives. They hurried past a knot of men, trainmen and engineer, yardmen, talking in low voices outside the train in the gashing lights of flares. A man held up a lantern, and Inspector Thum brushed it off from his face as the newcomers dashed to the closed exit of the rear car. Thum pounded with his hard fist on the door. A faint cry of "Here they are!" somewhere from the interior, and Conductor Bottomley shoved back the door, clinging against the catch in the wall. He pulled up a movable iron platform, revealing a flight of iron steps. "Police, where's the body?" They swarmed up the steps in the inspector's wake. "This way, rear car." They burst into the rear car. Lane had not moved. Their eyes went at once to the dead man. Nearby stood a local policeman with Teaneck station master, the junior conductor. "Murdered, hey?" Thum looked at Lane. "How the hell did this happen, Mr. Lane?" Lane moved slightly. "I shall never forgive myself, Inspector. A daring crime, a daring crime." His carved features had aged. Dr. Schilling, cloth hat, far back on his head, top coat open, dropped to his knees beside the body. "Touch him at all," he mumbled, fingers busy exploring. "Lane, Mr. Lane," said Bruno queerly. "Dr. Schilling's talking to you." Lane said mechanically. I shook him. His head rolled to one side, then back again to its original position. I bent over and felt his heart. There was blood on my hand. Otherwise, not a finger has been laid on him. They were silent then, watching Dr. Schilling. The medical examiner sniffed at the bullet hole, grasped the coat, and tugged. The bullet had pierced the coat through the handkerchief pocket of the left breast, entering the heart directly. The coat gave way with a sticky, tearing little sound. Plop. Through his coat, vest, shirt, undershirt, and heart. "Clean wound, all right," announced Dr. Schilling. There was little blood on the garments, a damp, ragged red ring about the hole on each piece of clothing. "Dead about an hour, I'd say," continued the medical examiner. He consulted his wristwatch. Then he felt the muscles of the dead arms and legs, grotesquely attempted to flex the dead knee joint. "Yep, died about 12:30. Maybe a few minutes before, I can't say exactly." They were staring at DeWitt's frozen face. A horrible, unnatural expression twisted and distorted the features. The expression was not difficult to interpret. It was stark, naked fear. Such fear as screwed up the eyes, laid tense ridges of muscle along the jaw, injected into every line an unmanning toxin that banished courage. Dr. Schilling exclaimed softly. Their eyes tore away from that terrifying dead face and turned in a battery to the left hand of the corpse, held up for their inspection by the doctor. "Look at these fingers," said Dr. Schilling. They looked. The middle finger was twined tightly over the forefinger in a peculiar sign. The thumb and remaining two fingers curved inward in death. "What the devil?" growled Thum. Bruno bent lower, eyes starting out of his head. "By God," he cried, "am I crazy or seeing things or what?" "Why," he laughed, "it's impossible. It can't be. This isn't Europe in the Middle Ages. That's the protection sign against the evil eye." They were silent. Then Thum muttered, "Hell, this is like a detective story. 10 to 1 there's a chink, with long things hiding in the toilet here." No one laughed. Dr. Schilling said, "Whatever it means, it's here to stay." He grasped the 2 overlapping fingers and struggled until his face crimsoned. He shrugged, rigor mortis, stiff as a board. Suppose DeWitt was slightly diabetic, probably didn't know it himself. Anyway, it would account for the rapidity with which rigor set in. He looked up, squinting. "Thum, suppose you try putting your fingers together this way?" Like mechanical men, they stared at the inspector. Without a word, he held up his right hand and with some difficulty managed to slide his middle finger over his forefinger. "Bear down, Thum," said Dr. Schilling, "tight, the way DeWitt has his. Now keep them that way for a few seconds." The inspector exerted pressure. His face flushed a little. "Quite an effort, hey, Thum," said the medical examiner dryly. "One of the funniest things in my experience, these dead fingers were so tightly linked that they didn't come apart even after death. I can't accept that evil eye explanation," said Thum stolidly, disengaging his fingers. "It's too damned storybookish. Doesn't hold water, as far as I'm concerned. Why? They'd laugh at us." "Suggest an alternative explanation," said Bruno. "Well," growled Thum, "all right, maybe the guy that pulled this job fixed DeWitt's fingers that way himself." "Nonsense," snapped Bruno. "That's an even wilder explanation than the obvious one. Why under the sun should a killer do that?" "Well, you'll see," said Thum, "you'll see. And what do you think, Mr. Lane?" "Must we seek agitator in this case?" Lane stirred. "I think," he said with infinite weariness, "that John DeWitt took very seriously a careless remark of mine earlier this evening." Thum began to demand an explanation, but fell silent when Dr. Schilling struggled to his feet. "Well, that's about all I can do here," said the physician. "One thing is sure, he died instantly." Lane made his first energetic movement, and in long minutes he gripped the medical examiner's arms. "You're certain of that, doctor?" "Instantly?" "Yeah. Yeah, absolutely certain. The bullet, probably from a .38, penetrated the heart through the right ventricle. It's the only wound, too, incidentally, from this superficial examination. His head is all right. There are no other signs of violence, no bruises anywhere?" "Not one. He was killed by one bullet in his pumper, and nothing else. And believe you me, that was plenty. Neatest hole I've seen in months." In other words, Dr. Schilling, DeWitt could not have twisted his fingers into this position during death throes. "Now listen here," said Dr. Schilling with some exasperation. "I just said he died instantly, didn't I? How in God's name could there have been death throes? A bullet through the ventricle and poof, out like a light. You mean you wouldn't be alive for like 10 seconds at least? Dead, finished. Man's not a guinea pig, you know? Hell no." Lane did not smile. He turned to Inspector Thum. "I think, Inspector," he said, "that's our irascible doctor's opinion goes far to clearing up an interesting point. What of it? Suppose he did die on the spot without a whisper. I've seen hundreds of stiffs who died instantly. Nothing new about that." "There is something new about this, Inspector," said Lane. Bruno glanced at him inquiringly, but Lane made no further comment. Thum shook his head and shoved past Dr. Schilling. He bent over the dead man and began unhurriedly to search his clothing. Lane altered his position so that he could see both Thum's face and the body of the dead man. "What's this?" muttered Thum. He had found in the inside breast pocket of DeWitt's coat a number of old letters, a checkbook, a fountain pen, a timetable, and 2 railroad trip books. Lane said coldly, "That is his old 50-trip book, which expired while he was detained in prison, and a new one which he purchased this evening before we boarded the train." The inspector grunted, flipped through the perforated pages of the old ticket book. Its edges were dog-eared on the cover of the book, and inside were numerous idle scribblings. Some traced the shapes of punch marks. Others traced printed words, geometric designs throughout, an indication of DeWitt's precise mentality. Most of the tickets had been torn out. He examined the new ticket book. It was intact, unpunched, just as DeWitt had bought it in the terminal, said Lane. "Who's the conductor here?" asked Thum. The old man in the blue conductor's uniform replied, "I am. Pop Bottomley's the name, senior on this run. What do you want to know?" "Recognize this man?" "Well," drawled Bottomley, "I was remarking to Mr. Lane over here before you came that this face looked kind of familiar. I remember now that he's been taking this train on and off for years. Seems like West Inglewood, ain't he? Did you see him on the train tonight?" "I did not. Wasn't sitting on my end while I was collecting tickets. You see him, Ed?" "Not tonight, I didn't," said the husky junior conductor timidly. "I know him all right, but I didn't see him tonight. When I got to the car forward, there was a party there, and one man, tall feller, handed me 6 tickets for the party. Said there was another one that had stepped out for a minute. Never did see him after that. You didn't get to him, eh?" "Hell, I didn't know where he was. Thought he was in the toilet, most likely. Never thought of this dark car. Nobody ever goes in here." "You say you knew DeWitt?" "That's his name. Well, he took the train pretty often. Remember him?" "All right. How often?" Ed lifted his cap and patted his bald head thoughtfully. "I don't know, Cap. Can't say how many times. Just on and off, I guess." Pop Bottomley thrust his energetic little body forward. "Guess I can settle that for you, mister. You see, pardner and I take this midnight run every night, so we can tell how many times this man took our train. Here, let me have that old trip book." He snatched the dog-eared book from Thum's fingers, opened it, and held it up for Thum's inspection. The others crowded around, looking over the inspector's shoulder. "Now, you see," said Bottomley officiously, pointing to the strips which had bordered the missing tickets. "We take out the tickets on each strip and punch the tickets and stub along the side to make sure. All you gotta do is add up the number of circle marks. There's my punches, see 'em? And the number of cross marks. There's Ed Thompson's here, and that'll tell you how many times he took this particular train, because we're the only men on this run. Get me?" Thum studied the old book. "Pretty cute at that. 40 punched altogether. Of the 40, let's say half covered trips. 2 New York, different punches, eh?" "Yep," said old Bottomley. "The morning trains, different conductors, and every conductor has a different punch." "All right," continued Thum. "That leaves 20 on the trip back to the West Inglewood nights. Of the 20, he counted rapidly. Let's see, 13 punched by your partner and you. 13 times. Then that he means he took the train oftener than the regular commuting train, around 6. Regular detective I am," grinned the old man. "You got it, mister. Punches don't lie." And he cackled with glee. Bruno frowned. "I'll wager the murderer knew DeWitt was in the habit of making this particular train oftener than the regular commuting train. Might be." Inspector Toon threw back his wide shoulders. "Here, now, let's get some other things straight, Mr. Lane. Just what did happen here tonight? How did DeWitt happen to get into this car?" Drury Lane shook his head. "Well, what actually occurred, I do not know. But not long after the train left Weehawken, Michael Collins—" "Collins!" shouted Thum. Bruno edged forward. "Is Collins on this thing, by God? Why didn't you say so before? Please, Inspector, a little self-control. Collins either got away or he did not. As soon as we discovered DeWitt's body, the conductors made sure that no one could leave the train. Even if he left before the discovery of the body, he cannot run away." Thum grunted, and Lane, in an even tone, related what had occurred in the car when Collins pleaded with DeWitt for a final private conversation. "And they went into this car, hey?" demanded Thum. "I said nothing of the kind, Inspector," retorted Lane. "You are assuming that. It may be true, but we saw merely that the 2 men crossed the rear platform to stand on the front platform of this car. Well, we'll find out soon enough." Thum dispatched several detectives with orders to search the train for the missing man. "You want to keep the body here, Thum?" asked Dr. Schilling. "Let him be," grumbled Thum. "Let's go up ahead and ask some questions." They trooped out of the death car, leaving a detective on guard beside the dead man. Jean DeWitt was crumpled on a seat, sobbing against Lord's shoulder. Ahern, Imperial, and Brooks sat stiffly, stunned. The car had been cleared of other passengers. They had been removed to the car ahead. Dr. Schilling moved quietly down the aisle and looked down at the weakly crying girl. Without a word, he opened his physician's bag and removed a small bottle. "Sent Lord for a cup of water and applied the open bottle to the girl's quivering nostrils. She gasped, blinked, and shuddered away. When Lord returned with the water, she drank it greedily, like a thirsty child. The doctor patted her head and forced something down her throat. In a few moments she had calmed and lay, eyes closed, with her head in Lord's lap. Thum sank into one of the green plush seats and stretched his legs. Bruno brooded over him. He beckoned to Brooks and Ahern, who rose wearily. Both men were white with strain. On being questioned by the district attorney, Brooks told briefly of the celebration party at the hotel, the trip to Weehawken, the wait in the terminal, the boarding of the train, the approach of Collins. How was DeWitt? Asked Bruno. Cheerful, never more cheerful in his life. I've never seen him happier, put in Ahern in a low voice. The trial, the suspense, and then that verdict. When I think that he was saved from the electric chair for this. He shivered. A flash of anger crossed the lawyer's face. Certainly the most devastating proof of DeWitt's innocence, Mr. Bruno. If you hadn't arrested him on the preposterous charge, he'd probably be alive today. Bruno was silent then. Where is Mrs. DeWitt? She wasn't with the party, said Ahern shortly. This will be good news for her, said Brooks. What do you mean? She can't be divorced now, replied Brooks in a dry voice. The district attorney and Thum exchanged glances. Then she wasn't on the train at all, asked Bruno. Not so far as I know. Brooks turned away. Ahern shook his head and Bruno looked at Lane, who shrugged. At this moment a detective reported with the information that Collins was nowhere to be found. Here. Where the devil are those conductors? Thum waved, and the blue-clad men toward him. Bottomley, did you see a tall, red-faced Irish man? Remember, collecting his ticket tonight, he was wearing, said Lane quietly, a felt hat pulled rakishly down over his eyes, a tweed topcoat, and he was slightly intoxicated. Old Bottomley shook his head. Pretty sure I didn't take his ticket. You had? The junior conductor shook his head. Thum roused himself. He stamped to the forward coach and began to thunder questions at the few passengers who had been seated in the same car with DeWitt party. No one recalled Collins or anything about his movements. Thum returned and sat down again. Remember anybody of Collins come back through this car? Lane said. I'm sure he did not, Inspector. In all probability, he slipped off the train from one of the two platforms in the rear. It would be simple enough to open one of the doors and jump off. I am certain that we stopped somewhere between that time DeWitt and Collins disappeared and the time of the tragedy. Thum demanded a timetable from the old conductor and studied it. By comparing various items of the schedule, he concluded that it was possible for Collins to have slipped off the train when it stopped at either a Little Ferry, Ridgefield Park, Westview, or even Bogota. Okay, he said, and turned to one of his men. Take a couple of the boys and retrace the route through these stations. Pick up Collins's trail. He must have got off on one of them and left some kind of sign behind. Report to me by phone to the Teaneck station. Right, and it doesn't look as if he could have got a train going back to New York at that hour, so don't forget to question the taxi drivers around the stations. The detective left. Now, men, said Thum to the two conductors, think hard. Did any passengers get off the train at Little Ferry, Ridgefield Park, Westview, or Bogota? The conductors replied promptly that several passengers had detrained at each of the cited local stops, but neither recalled their number or identities. Might recognize some of them, maybe, drawled Pop Bottomley if we saw them, but we wouldn't know their names even if they were regular passengers. Wouldn't know the others at all, volunteered Thompson. Bruno said, you know, Thum, it would have been possible for the murderer as well as Collins to have slipped off the train at the station without being seen. All anyone had to do was wait until the train stopped at the station. Open the door, facing not the station, but the tracks, and hop off, closing the door behind him from below. After all, there were only two conductors on the train, and they couldn't keep track of every exit. Sure, anybody could have done it, I'd like, growled Thum, to run across one bump off where the murderer is found standing over the body with a gun in his hand. And where the hell is that gun, Duffy? Find a revolver in that car back there. The sergeant shook his head. Search the whole shooting match. It's possible the guy who did it left the gun on the train. I suggest, said Lane, that you send men to search the route we have traversed, Inspector, for it is also possible the murder threw the revolver from the train and that it fell to the track somewhere. Good idea. Duffy, take care of that. The sergeant stumped off. Now, continued Thum, passing one hand wearily over his forehead, now for the dirty work. He glared at the 6 members of the DeWitt party. Imperial, step over here, will you? The Swiss heaved to his feet and approached with lagging steps. Fatigue had darkened the area of his eyes, and even his Van Dyke was in a bedraggled state. Matter of form, said Thum with heavy sarcasm. What were you doing on this trip? Where were you sitting? I sat with Mrs. DeWitt and Mr. Lord for a time. Then, seeing that they preferred to be alone, I excused myself and moved away. I must have dozed off. The next thing I remember, Mr. Lane was standing in the doorway and the 2 conductors were running past me. Dozing? It is like really late at night, man. Imperial's eyebrows went up. Yes, he said with sharpness. Do you doubt my word? The ferry and train ride has induced a headache. Oh, yes, jeered Thum, so you couldn't tell us what the others were doing, hey? I am sorry I was asleep. Thum brushed by the Swiss and walked to the seat in which Lord held Jean in his arms. He leaned over and tapped the girl's shoulder. Lord looked up angrily. Jean raised a tear-stained face. Sorry to trouble you, Miss DeWitt, said Thum gruffly, but it would help me if you answered a question too. Are you crazy, man? Snapped Lord. Can't you see she's in a state of exhaustion? Thum stared him into silence. Jean whispered, Anything, Inspector, only find out who. Leave that to us. Miss DeWitt, do you recall what you and Mr. Lord were doing after the train left Weehawken? She looked at him blankly, only half comprehending. We were together most of the time. At first, Mr. Imperial sat with us. Then he went off somewhere. We talked, and all the time she bit her lips. Tears sprang into her eyes. Yes, Miss DeWitt, Kit left me once. I remained alone for a few minutes. Left you, did he? That's fine, and where did he go? Thum glanced slightly at the young man, who sat in perfect silence. Oh, just out the door, she pointed vaguely. At the front door, the car didn't say where he was going, or did you, Kit? No, darling. Did you see Mr. Imperial after he left you and Lord? Once while Kit was away, I turned around and saw him a few seats back, dozing. I also saw Mr. Ahern walking up and down. Then Kit came back. When was this? She sighed. I don't remember it exactly. I threw him straight, and I'd like to speak to you aside, Lord. Here, Imperial, or Doc Schilling, will you please sit with Miss DeWitt for a moment? Lord rose reluctantly, and the stubby little medical examiner took the seat. He began at once to speak to the girl in a conversational tone. The 2 men went up the aisle. Now, Lord, said Thum, come clean. Where'd you go? It's quite a story, Inspector, replied the young man steadily. While we were coming over the ferry, I happened to notice something, well, queer. I caught sight of Cherry Brown and that seedy boyfriend of hers, Pollux, on the same boat. No kidding, Thum nodded slowly. Hey, Bruno, come here a minute. The district attorney complied. Lord said he saw Cherry Brown and Pollux on the ferry tonight. Coming over, Bruno whistled. That's not all either, continued Lord. I caught sight of them again in the terminal, not the piers. They were arguing about something. I kept my eyes open after that because, well, it looked like damn fishy to me. I didn't see them in the waiting room, and I watched when we got on the train, although I don't remember seeing them get on either. Anyway, when the train started, I became uneasy. Why? Lord scowled. That brown woman is a tartar. I don't know what that means. I know what tartar sauce is. I don't know what this word means in this context. Like, the only time I've seen this word is, as a fish sandwich. Where did that sauce come from initially? I know there's cream of tartar. That's like some sort of white powder I see in the seasoning aisle, but I don't remember what it's made of. I didn't know what she might be up to, considering the wild accusations she made against DeWitt during the Longstreet investigation. Anyway, I excused myself and Jean. I wanted to make absolutely sure they weren't on the train. I looked and they weren't, so I came back feeling better. Did you look into the rear car? God, no. How could I think they were there? Near what station was this? Lord shrugged. Hanged if I know. I didn't notice. Did you see anyone else? Did you see what anyone else was doing when you came back? Well, I seem to recall Ahern walking back and forth both times. And I remember seeing Mr. Lane and Brooks talking. Did you notice Imperial when they came back? Can't remember. All right, get back to Miss DeWitt. I guess she needs you. Lord hastened away, and Bruno and Thum conversed in low tones for a few moments. Then Thum beckoned a detective on the guard for the forward car. Tell Duffy to search the train for Cherry Brown and Pollux. He knows their faces. The detective went away. In a short time, the bulky figure of Sergeant Duffy barged into the car. Nothing doing, Inspector. They aren't here, and nobody remembers seeing two people of their description. All right, Duffy, that makes it your assignment. Get somebody on it right away. Better do it yourself at that. Shoot back to town and see if you can pick up their trail. The woman lives at the Hotel Grant. If they're not there, try some nightclubs. A couple of Pollux's hangouts. They might be in a speak. Phone me when you get a lead. And stay on it all night if necessary. Sergeant Doofy grinned and swung off. Now then, Brooks, Thum, and the district attorney walked back up the aisle. Brooks and Lane were sitting together. I'm so tired. Brooks staring out of the window at... I was about to read that as Tyranids, like fucking Warhammer 40k. In fact, it says train yards. Lane, with his head resting against the back of the seat, eyes closed. They opened and flashed a remarkable brilliancy as Thum sat down opposite. Bruno had hesitated, then retreated to the van of the coach, going to the car ahead. How about you, Brooks? Asked Thum heavily. God, I'm tired. This damned thing routed me out of bed. Well, what? What were you doing on this trip? I didn't leave this seat until Mr. Lane got up to investigate the continued absence of DeWitt and Collins. Thum looked at Lane, and Lane nodded. That's Jake for you, then. He twisted his head. Ahern, the elderly man plodded up. What were you doing all the time the train started? Ahern laughed without honor. The ancient game of hide-and-seek, Inspector? Nothing extraordinary. Mr. Lane, Mr. Brooks, and I engaged in general discussion for some time. Then I felt like stretching my legs and got up, walked around up and down the aisle, that's all. Notice anything? Did you see anyone through the rear door of the car? Frankly, I wasn't watching. I saw nothing suspicious, if that's what you mean. Did you see anything? Cried Thum in an exasperated voice. Nothing in that direction, Inspector, nor anything else for that matter. In fact, I was thinking out a rather unique gambit. A what? A gambit, a series of chess moves, Inspector. Oh, you're the chess shark. Okay, Ahern. Thum turned his head to find Lane's gray eyes regarding him with curiosity, and of course, Inspector, Lane was saying, you must question me also. Thum snorted. If you saw anything in this car, you'd tell us. No. You're wrong there, Mr. Lane. As a matter of fact, murmured Lane, I have never felt more humiliated, more abased in my life, to allow this dreadful thing to happen virtually under my nose. He regarded his hands thoughtfully, so near. He looked up. Unfortunately, I became so absorbed in my pleasant discussion with Mr. Brooks that I noticed nothing. I was increasingly anxious, however, and it was this anxiety that prompted me to get up later and investigate the dark car. You didn't keep tabs on everything in this car, I suppose? To my everlasting shame, Inspector, I did not. Thum got to his feet. The district attorney came into the car, leaned against the seat across the aisle. I've just been quizzing the other passengers, he said. No one who was in this car remembers a thing or recalls who passed up at the aisle and who didn't. I never saw such an unobservant bunch. As for the passengers in the other cars, they're useless. How? Well, we'll take their names anyway. Thum moved away. I began to issue orders. The rest of the party kept silent until we returned. Lane was sitting in his habitual attitude of concentration with closed eyes. A man ran up to the inspector. A lead, Chief, he cried. Just got a call from one of the gang that Collins has been traced. The heavy air was suddenly surcharged with sparks. Good boy, cried Thum. What's the lay? He was seen at Ridgefield Park. He hired a hack and headed toward New York. One of the boys called from the city because... in case you guys are curious what I'm drinking, I have an empty bottle of Body Armor orange mango flavor. It's like a electrolyte water, but that's not what I'm drinking out of it. I poured some whole milk, vitamin D milk in this. Hold on. I had to sneeze. I at least held the microwave far away as I could. I feel like I had to sneeze again. Anyway, so I put some cocoa powder in this and shook it up. It's not bad chocolate milk, though I think the Hershey syrup makes it better. Parts of it are still powdery, though. Should have put it in a protein shaker bottle with one of those little, metal balls that can go flat and helps to break up the powder. Oh. He figured Collins went back home, and sure enough, Collins had gotten a few minutes before. Looks at the taxi, took him straight home. The boys will get the driver later. He hadn't got back yet. They're watching outside Collins' apartment. Want orders? Fine. Is he still on the phone? One of them is. Tell him to leave Collins alone unless he tries to sneak off. I'll be there myself in an hour or so, but tell him he can give up his shield if that Irish mug gets away. The detective hurried out of the train. Thum pounded the floor with his huge feet gleefully. Another detective came in. Thum looked up with anticipation. Well, the man shook his head. The boys haven't located that gat yet. It's nowhere on the train. We've pawed all over the passengers, too, and nothing doing. Haven't heard anything yet from the boys searching the tracks down the line. They're trying, but it's dark as hell. Keep at it, Duffy. Vast surprise leaped into Thum's face. For the square figure of Sergeant Duffy, who was supposed to be heading for New York City, lurched into the car. Duffy, what in God's name are you doing here? Duffy took off his cap and swabbed his perspiring brow, but he was grinning. Did a little detective work myself, Chief. I thought, seeing as how this brown dame hangs out at the Grant, I'd phone the desk there and find out if she was in before I beat it. Knew you'd be leaving soon. Wanted to get the info for you if I could before you headed back. Well. She clicked, Chief, roared Duffy. She's there. And I'll be a three-horned son of a bull if that guy Pollux didn't come in with her. When clerk at the desk says they checked in a few minutes before I called, and they both went up to her rooms. Were they seen leaving? Nope. Good work. We'll stop there on our ways to Collins's joint. You beat it to the grunt and keep an eye out. Grab a cab. As Sergeant Duffy plowed out of the car, he encountered a group of new figures. Men were pouring into the coach, led by a medium-sized tow-headed man. Here, where are you going? Growled Duffy. One side, officer. I'm the district attorney of this county. Duffy cursed and swung off the train. Bruno hurried forward in the towhead, like T-O-W? Like, how do you... Shook his hand briefly. He introduced himself as District Attorney Cole of Bergen County. Routed out of bed, he complained by a message from Bruno. Bruno led Cole back to the rear car, where Cole examined DeWitt's now stark body. They became involved in a polite discussion as to legal jurisdiction. Bruno pointed out that while DeWitt had been murdered in Bergen County, his murder was unquestionably related to the Wood killing in Hudson County and the Longstreet killing in New York County. They stared at each other. Cole threw up his hands. The next one, I suppose, will be in Frisco. All right, Bruno, it's your case. I guess I'll help all I can. They retraced their steps. The cars suddenly became the swirling center of a violent commotion. A New Jersey hospital ambulance discharged 2 interns, and under the supervision of Dr. Schilling, DeWitt's corpse was carried out of the train. The medical examiner waved a weary farewell and went off with the ambulance. In the train, the entire company of passengers were herded together, severely lectured by Inspector Thum, their names and addresses checked, and they were released. A special train for their use had been pressed into service by railroad officials and roared out of Teaneck. You won't forget now, admonished Bruno as Cole and he stood talking in the forward car. You'll look for the passengers who got off before the murder was discovered. I'll do my best, said Cole gloomily. But frankly, I don't think it will result in anything. The innocent ones will come in, and if there's the guilty one among them, he'll stay away. And there you are. One other thing, Cole. Thum's men are scouting around up the line, along the tracks and roadbed, looking for the revolver on the chance that it was thrown from the train. Will you send Jersey men to relieve them and continue the search? It will be light soon, and they'll be able to see better. Of course, we've had the DeWitt party, as well as the rest of the crowd, searched, and the gun wasn't found. Cole nodded and left the train. The party reassembled in the forward car. Thum was struggling into his topcoat. Well, Mr. Lane, he said, what do you say about this crime? Does it verify your other ideas? Do you still think, put it in Bruno, that you know who killed Longstreet and Wood? Lane smiled for the first time since he had discovered DeWitt's body. I not only know who killed Longstreet and Wood, but I also know who killed DeWitt. They stared at him, speechless. For the second time since Thum had met Lane, he shook his head like a fighter shaking off the effects of a head blow. Whew, he said, I give up. But Mr. Lane, protested Bruno, let's do something. If you know, tell us and we'll nab him. This can't go on forever. Who is it? Lane's face dropped into haggard lines. When he spoke, it was with some difficulty. I'm sorry, gentlemen, you must have, odd, isn't it, faith in me? Believe me when I say I would do not the slightest good. Believe me when I say it would do not the slightest good to unmask our Mr. X now. You must have patience. I am playing a dangerous game, but haste would be ruinous. Bruno groaned. He appealed helplessly to Thum, who was thoughtfully sucking his forefinger. Thum looked into Lane's clear eyes with sudden decision. Okay, Mr. Lane. Whatever you say goes with me. I'll fight it out on my side, and I know Bruno will on his. If I'm wrong in you, I'll take my licking like a man, because I'm absolutely... This is between you and me. Up a tree. Lane flushed, the first sign of emotional response he had exhibited. There may be another murder if we let this crazy killer run around loose, said Bruno with a final desperate lunge. You may take my word for it, Mr. Bruno. Lane's voice was dryly assured. There will be no other murders. X is finished.